Hello everyone, my name's Dane. In this video, I'm chatting to Shane from SAS Asset Management, and we're going to be talking about asset health scores, criticality, and MTBF, MTTF, MTTR type metrics. This is the first interview video that I'm going to post, and if you like this type of content, please let me know in the comments and I'll make more of them. Let's get into it. First off, general intro. Do you want to introduce yourself and tell everyone what you do and what your jam is?
Yeah, sure. My name's Shane. Thanks, Dane, for having us. My name's Shane. I'm fortunate enough to work in the asset management industry, and my company is SAS Asset Management, and we provide what we call asset management and dependability engineering services to industry. And we're really passionate about keeping things practical, pragmatic, and agile. And when I saw your post about, criticality and chuck it all in the bin, I thought, well, we can be a bit practical and pragmatic about that. So here we are today. So yeah, thanks for having me.
No worries. Yeah, that post was a bit provocative. I mean,
yeah,
it's not
a bit.
Yeah. Look, I think for those of you who haven't seen the post, I'll chuck it up on this video so you can see it in a second. But I think, of course, there's kind of what do you want to call it? Sort of the pragmatic approach, and I'm not expecting everyone to just take what they're doing and bin it and not have anything kind of to replace it with or anything. But deep down, going through building asset health scores and criticality and all that kind of stuff, and seeing the benefits and disbenefits of that approach, deep down, I think there is something wrong with it, and I want to explore that with you, because there's not too many people in the industry that'll push back and challenge my thinking and my ideas that I have. And because you said let's have a chat, I'm super keen to kind of go through it with you, and explain my viewpoint and get yours and see where we land, because I think there's something to it, but we'll find out in this. So we'll start with asset health indices, or asset health scores, or how whatever you want to call it, same sort of
condition ratings or whatever you want to call it, right? Yeah.
So let's start with, like, how would you define it? I think for a lot of these asset management terms that are getting thrown around, one of my key issues is how they're defined and, like, what exactly do they mean? And so what's your thoughts? Like, where do you stand on what is asset health indice or asset health score?
So this dovetails into something I'm very strong on, Dane, is taking what we like to call, as sort of consultants, better practice in the industry, and taking that and applying better practice in the context of your organisation. So whether it's water or electricity or whatever, to create what I like to term as best practice for you. So, you've got, like, this simple term, you've got these, standards like ISO 55001, which talks about the asset management system. That would be better practice, right? We've got an industry body saying, this is a good idea, look at this. But then when you look at your organisation's, specific context, does that actually work for you, right? And can you take that and make that into best practice for you? And that's something that I'm pretty strong about, is so there's no rules with this, right? Let's be practical and pragmatic and agile about how we apply these things. So coming back to asset condition or health index and so on and so forth, right? Essentially what I see that's required by high-level strategic asset managers or board of directors or CEOs is a sense of what state is my asset base in, and what does that look like from a risk perspective? Am I wearing more risk this year versus last year? Do I feel that risk is under control or out of control? And however an organisation does that, right, each their own, from my perspective, as long as it's been considered and not blindly applied, right? And I think it's really important when you say, what is it? How do you define it? I don't think there should be a definition of it within industry. I think there should be a definition of it within an organisation.
Okay, so a couple of things to break apart there. One is that you said that the end game is understanding risk, which I think is a good end game. And then having no clear definition, like one that's transferable from business to business, is a bit of a problem. Although I do think that you at least need to define it within your business. Like you need to say for us, this is what asset health score is, or this is what this index is, and what does it mean? And so then my question would be, all right, let's take any particular example. Let's come up with a definition for what that health score means. And I'm yet to see a decent definition, I guess. Like, so for example, some companies say, oh, it represents, it's a proxy for probability of failure or something. Like the higher the health score, the more likely it is to fail. And then when you add on the consequence, you can infer the risk profiles and stuff. But
it's like indicative, right? It's like, maybe there's a correlation there.
Yeah, and then some say, it could be we've gone and done a condition assessment or something, and it's it has this particular fault, like it's a bearing fault or something, and then so we're going to come up with a score to represent that. And I just I don't know. I think that if there's a bearing fault, say this asset has a bearing fault, not it's a 7.5 or something. You get what I mean?
Yeah, and like I'm picturing like the P to F curve, right? And it's saying, well, there's a fault present, right? So P has started, right? And it's like, if it's a condition 6, maybe it's right after the P. And if it's like condition 10, it's right before the F. Like that's sort of what I'm picturing as you'd sort of describe that.
Yeah, like and you can say that, you can define that as like anytime something hits a P, we're going to start scoring it on a 1 to 10 scale as it degrades. But then the problem is that there's no link back to time or speed of degradation, because that P to F could be 6 months, it could be 2 years, it could be all varying. So then it's like, what do we do with that score? How do we use it to infer next actions? And like I guess that's where it kind of breaks down for me. It's like one.
So what?
Varying. Sorry. Yeah.
It's like, so what?
Yeah, and I guess what's your thoughts on that? Like,
so in the defense industry, they've got this really nifty term, and I've not come across it too often elsewhere, and I think it better describes your sentiment. They call it indicator of risk. And so like perhaps condition rating, whatever it is, right? It's just a black box condition rating. You put some stuff in, outcomes and condition rating. Who cares? That's like an indicator of risk, right? The risk is not necessarily defined or well understood, but we know or we feel that there's more risk here compared to another asset. Perhaps that's a way we can start looking at it. And like you said, the time element. Well, once we have something that's giving us a higher indicator of risk, we can do some sort of modelling, whether it's probabilistic physics of failure modelling or FMEA or so on and so forth, to better understand that. I suppose that the important thing, I think, from an asset management perspective is, where are we carrying more risk? And it's probably more of a question is, where do we feel we're carrying more risk versus where do we feel we're not carrying a lot of risk? It's very subjective, though.
So I'll just pull you up on something that you said. You keep talking about risk, and for the way I understand the asset health index, asset health indices or asset health index or whatever you want to call it, it shouldn't be a proxy for consequence, because we're talking about the asset health, right? Like the health of that motor or pump. And therefore, there's like this other part of the risk equation that we need to consider. So, right. So we agree on that?
Yeah, absolutely. For sure.
So then, if it's just a if the score is a proxy for the condition / probabilities, however you want to define it and however you want to roll what you know about that asset up into a metric, should that number be used in a risk calculation? Because you know that like there's the different probabilities of different events carry different consequences. Like you can have certain failures that are much more safety risk than other failures and so on. And I guess where I keep going back to this is that you, in my view, you need to have that mode and consequence level granularity view of the asset in order to figure out not just what your risk is, but what to do about it.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to come back to what is the actual use case for a health index.
Yeah.
And
sure.
So far to me, it only seems like an indicator / reporting type thing. But we can't use that to report on risk. We can just use it to report on general kind of health of the assets. And is that, if we can't act on it, is that something useful to report on?
Yeah, okay. And I think probably take another step back is we need to have clearly defined asset management objectives to understand risk, right? So the definition of risk being uncertainty of objectives. So it sort of brings into the question of, well, if you've got 20 asset management objectives, well, first up, that's probably too many. But you've got, and they're very specific. They stay in their lane, right? So there's a performance objective, right? There's a safety objective, right? And then there might be an environmental objective. Let's just have those three objectives, right? They never cross over to each other, right? They stay in their lane. It's very clear and concise and demarcated. And then we can start to talk about, like you said, the likelihood aspect of risk in not achieving that objective. So therefore, if you're starting to think about rolling up asset condition or health into a metric, then you need to sort of at least consider three sort of buckets, perhaps at that level, because you've got three sort of objectives. Then you can start to see, well, of that risk that I've calculated, and however you do it, again, it's a black box, is what's like contributing to that risk, whether it's the performance aspect or the safety or the environmental aspect. And then I think from there, like you said, it becomes just this indicator to support to support a decision of some sort. Do we investigate this further and understand this better and fully, if you can actually fully understand risk? There's always that uncertainty in risk itself, the uncertainty of the uncertainty. Do we investigate it further and improve our uncertainty of our risk? Mind the dog. Or do we do anything else? I think, does that sort of come back to your question? She's sort of distracted me a little bit. But,
all right. Yeah, I guess if you have information on what the defects are from a condition assessment, and you understand what like the likelihood and consequence of each of the, let's say, mode related events are, then that's what you need to make the decision.
Yep.
Like on what you do and how you go forward and so on. So my question keeps coming back as to like, why are we rolling this up? Why are we rolling these I found it bearing defect numbers up into a score, which then is just to appease the managers and stuff with their dashboards, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, okay, so maybe take yourself out of that context. Like I feel your mind's in a bearing context, right? Try and take your mind out of that and maybe consider it in a transport network, right?
Okay.
And consider it from a parliamentary aspect. This is a real example, and people who know me will pick up on this example, but I won't tell you what actually.
Fair enough.
But imagine one of your parliamentary members asked, is the metro train system in better condition than the tram system? We need to answer that, right? If they need, and like that they need to make a decision. This ministerial person, whoever it is, needs to make. They've got a decision to make, and one of those inputs into that decision is what's in better condition, the train or the tram network, right? We need it, and they're a ministerial person, so they don't have time for, P tests and all these wonderful, beautiful things that we as reliability engineers enjoy doing. They don't have time for that. So we need to sort of be able to articulate a way to say, on aggregate or on average or whatever your framework is for determining sort of almost system level condition score, how do we do that?
Yeah, that gets into the world of politics for me, and it's
it's a very real thing. Right?
I mean, there's so much. I think there's like so much separation between what's going on at the asset level and that let's say tram network
system level is what we call it. Right?
Yeah, that there's just it's fraught with assumptions and politics, and it's like, okay, I got the lowest score, now I get more money from the government to fix my network up, and And again, it's not really it's a decision-making metric for the politicians, but it's not a decision-making metric for how you should be managing your assets, right?
Yeah. I mean, if you come down a level, then okay, and we're looking at a train operator, so it's certainly not political. I mean, there are political aspects to it, but if we say, well, if I'm an infrastructure manager in the train network, and I've got this budget of $100 million this year to spend, and look, I've done a bit of work developing that budget, but as things go, budgets change. You say, well, where am I better to spend that money? And of course, you've got to balance risk, cost, and performance. The asset management sort of aspects of that. And I see the condition metric being, again, that indicator of risk to say, well, and certainly if there's like KPIs and metrics on them, they're going to try and improve that condition. They say, well, maybe I need to spend less money on the car parks. I'll just pull something out of the periphery and put that into something else, and I can improve my indicator of risk. Now, that's all assuming that there is a strong correlation between the condition metric that you've created and actual risk, right? Let's assume that. But it just allows, I suppose, that lever, that decision to be made. Otherwise, like, how do you do it at an asset portfolio level?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it's actually, this is one that I've been down the rabbit hole quite a few times, because in previous roles I've implemented value frameworks with different electricity companies, and they do the whole portfolio optimization stuff, right? And so one of the things that you find is that there's a strategy element to it, so the organization can choose whether they want to be trying to maximize condition, or trying to like minimize risk, or trying to maximize value, or they set some sort of like objective function up where it's like, this is what I'm trying to achieve: minimize customer interruptions, maximize this, do all that kind of stuff, right? And then that's what their objective should be, and the metrics that they should be reporting on, specifically at this sort of network manager level, should be reflective of that, not so much the condition of the assets, which sort of sits down a couple of rungs from that decision. And you can get crazy tricky with this stuff too, right, with optimization functions and stuff. But like, to put it simply, it's like, what are you trying to achieve, and then how are we going to figure out a way to bridge the gap between where we're at and that, and use different indicators to kind of measure along the journey. And it's
and look, I don't think it's going to be valuable at that tactical, almost operational level to say asset A, is in worse condition than asset B, right? And they're actual physical assets. Because by and large, there's not going to be too much disparity. But when you start to sort of aggregate or roll up, and you can start to see, well, actually my electrical system is, by this metric, is in far worse condition or poorer health than my track system, right? You can start to say, okay, right, this makes sense. Whether you agree or not with the metric, as long as there's a consistent approach, you can start to compare the apples with the oranges.
Yeah, I feel you. I guess the only last thing I would say on that is if you're not making decisions at an asset level using that health metric, right, and you're doing it based on, let's say, total risk or whatever you want to calculate, that still should be linked up to the objective.
Yeah, sure.
Some way. As you say, we're trying to minimize risk. That's how we're operating day to day. And then the question is, if that's the way you're doing it at that low level, that should be the objective of the higher level as well. And therefore, the need of an asset health score shouldn't be filtered up. It should be like, this is where our risk sits in terms of, let's call it just some risk score on an asset, or I don't know how you want to call it, but
same thing, right? It's the same thing, risk score or, an asset health index, same thing.
So can we improve this? Like, would you recommend any different ways of doing it?
Well, certainly having asset management objectives that are what I like to call mono-dimensional. They stay in their lane, right? It's very clear. You don't have this, airy-fairy, very high-level objective that encompasses, every aspect of your business, because then how do you put uncertainty in that? So having very clear asset management objectives, and then obviously physical condition, corrosion, cracks, bearing defects, all these things is really important. And having a way to compare one severity of a defect to another severity of defects, right or wrong. Well, in fact, it's going to be wrong, right? It's just a question of how wrong it is, right? And maybe you can live with how wrong it is, or maybe not. But certainly being clear that, a rating 5 in corrosion, may or may not be the same as a rating 5 in the bearings, right? Hopefully you've done decent enough work and you've been able to do that, but by and large, it's not going to be. But having that sort of clearly done in the physical condition is a simple one. But then you need to look at, and what I find in my work, the non-physical aspects almost become like these latent conditions within a system, and such as obsolescence is a really simple thing that I'm really, really passionate about. Is the OEM supplying that thing now anymore? Do we have contracts in place with the OEM? And building on your uncertainty in, providing the performance, simply from not being able to get supply of, a part, and whether it's a bespoke part or it's a simple bearing from SKF or NSK, having an understanding of your supply chain is really key. So that's like this latent condition, because if you've got a fleet of vehicles that all use the same tyre, right? That's an example I've had you refer to a few times, Dane, the tyre degradation, right? You've got the same tyre, and you've got 100 vehicles, that's nominally 4 or 5 tyres per vehicle. Suddenly, if there's a supply issue with that, I call it like a latent condition, because it just affects the entire fleet, right? So having a good understanding of that is really important. Then the last part I really like to focus on is, certainly in my work, is like regulatory impacts and things like accessibility type of thing. Like, is there sort of a new law that's coming in that's going to affect, the accessibility of my assets, and therefore, there's more risk there associated with that, because in a couple of years' time, that asset is actually going to be non-compliant to whatever sort of framework that has been brought in. having a good understanding of that. And then probably lastly, starting to look at like, and this is probably right up your alley, is that asset or system starting to fail more and more? And is that, if it's an overhaul component or whatever for a single asset, or if it's at a system level, is our failure rate nominally staying the same as we'd expect because we're mature asset managers and we appreciate that things do fail? Or is it starting to kick off and, you've got your ROCOF and so on and so forth to inform that? And sort of incorporating that aspect, it's physical, but it's not, because it's like indicative. You don't actually know what the root cause is. You just know that something's wrong in there. So incorporating those things into some sort of health aspect. So to summarize, you've got physical condition, you've got some sort of obsolescence measurement in there, what's called system performance or asset performance in there. But again, these are your objectives. That would be my sort of guidance. But again, there's no silver bullet for any organization.
I might see the obsolescence stuff slightly different to how you're sort of presenting it here, because to me it's like obsolescence has nothing to do with the physical asset that's right there, and to me it's the way I've seen it represented before is more on the consequence side, right? Like if we have issues with this, then we're going to have to like redesign the whole system, or like there's going to be extreme downtime because we can't get lead items on time and whatever. Yep. And so it's kind of like the severity of the downtime goes through the roof in terms of production losses, but also time and all that other stuff. And therefore that increases the essentially the value of that asset to a point where it's cost beneficial to get rid of it and bring a new version in, right? So that sits, to me, that sits outside of asset health when you're assessing the health. And I've seen a lot of other companies as well take into account factors like different environments that it's in and the way it's being used and all of that kind of stuff. But that doesn't make sense to me either. Like the asset health should be like a representation of what it is right now, like what condition is it in right now? Because if I took it out of that context and put it in a different part of the plant where the environmental conditions and duty and everything are different, still should have the same condition if you go by the definition of like what the condition of something is. And so to me, like it's about pulling apart all of that stuff and saying, what is this definition of asset health that we're talking about? And I'm still.
So I think there's a difference between, like just a logical difference between condition and health ratings. I see condition being purely physical, and health being more general, if you like.
So where's the boundary on the physical then?
Yeah, so I think it's, in my opinion, I think it's the boundary lies with physical defects.
So ones you can identify with like condition assessment.
You can measure, you can look at it, you can smell it, you can sniff it, whatever you want to do.
Yeah, okay.
Very physical, but then there's the health aspect, which, there are all sort of connotations and permutations of health that you can make. But I see them as incorporating the physical, but also, incorporating the non-physical things, the non-physical indicators. And like you said, with supportability, if you pick that asset up from here and put it over here where the environment's worse, well, the supportability goes with it, right? You still can't get the things. So I see them as two different things, health and condition.
Yeah, I've always used them as like almost interchangeably, like asset health and condition, they're kind of the same. But as long as you're kind of defining what sits in the boundary, right, it's all good. And okay.
And like I'm doing work in the transport sector at the moment that is looking at the difference between condition, physical condition, and what people understand condition to be. And they're obviously varying takes on that. But then taking like the the range of those understandings and chopping them up and saying, well, actually, what you're saying by our definition is physical condition, and what these people are saying is a mixture of physical condition and non-physical condition. But being, like you said, define it, right, and show how it all works together and comes together, and you do you.
Yeah, that's one of the key bits. As long as we can talk the same language with a clear definition, then we're already on our way. So,
but then again, like thinking of like your key industries like water, for example, or power, but those industry or those companies within that industry, working together for the most part or by some parts. So there is a need to, well, you do you, but you also need to do us, and we need, like it has to be this sort of
the regulator needs to be able to equalize across all of them and make sure they're all on the same playing field and not reporting differently. So,
but this is context, right?
Yeah. Do you want to move on to criticality?
Oh, yeah, criticality is a wicked one. Let's do it.
All right.